Dr. Justin Wirth is now a research engineer at Birck. His current work is focusing on e-beam lithography processing services. He's organizing wiki and also web forum. So without further ado, let's welcome Sam to interview Dr. Justin Wirth today. Welcome.
Well, thank you very much for the kind introduction, Joy. And Justin, thank you so much for agreeing to this interview. And also, on behalf of everyone from NSAC and also from Birck, it's not said enough, but thank you so much for all of your efforts at improving the sort of tools, the communication between staff and students, and just generally being an all-around great person.
No, I don't. Yeah, you're very welcome.
We need a lead with this because it's not said enough, and whatever they pay you, it's not enough. So
no, yeah, thank you very much for the kind words. Happy to be here and talking to you.
I'm so happy to be able to interview you today. So to get started, we're going to ask the most hard-hitting questions first. So the first one is, what is your favorite color?
Depending on the day, probably either green or blue, but it's funny. So I have a 3-year-old son, so it doesn't really matter because he always gets to pick first, and then my wife. So I'm usually left with the yellows or the oranges. So you kind of got to deal with what you can get.
Okay, so your son is, how old is your son now?
He's 3. He'll be 4 in February.
Okay, so he has a very strong opinion.
Yes.
On the color. Oh, in February. Okay, so it's coming up soon.
Pieces, those kinds of things. So yeah, and everybody has to be a different color, right? So that's usually. But yeah, I would prefer the cooler colors, green, blues, those sorts of things.
Okay. So now that we've gotten the most hard-hitting part of the interview out of the way, we can proceed. So I see that it looks like, just glancing over your resume, that you're like a full-blooded Purdue Boilermaker from beginning to kind of end, from BSc, PhD. Now you're employed at Purdue. So before we get to Purdue, I want to ask you, like, kind of where are you from originally, and that kind of thing.
Yeah, so originally from Louisville, Kentucky. So that's right on south down by the Indiana border, and grew up in southern Indiana, so right across the river from there, but still in kind of the Louisville metro area. And really until I came to Purdue. So so definitely Indiana is a very different part of Indiana though, because it's much hillier and kind of greener, not just kind of the flat kind of gray that you get up in the northern half of the state. But yeah, definitely still Indiana.
It is definitely a small world, because one summer I actually worked in Louisville and stayed there for the summer. So yeah, it's crazy how everyone's kind of lives overlap. Maybe we were even there at well, I guess you were at Purdue by then, but maybe we were in the same city at the same time all those years ago.
Yeah, no, it is funny how that works. Yeah, and it is, especially in the Midwest, there's not a ton of kind of huge hubs, right? I mean, you've kind of got Chicago, Indianapolis,
St. Louis,
Columbus, Dayton. But yeah, I could definitely see that. That's neat.
So if somebody goes to visit Louisville, what is the most important thing that they must do if they're in Louisville? Otherwise, they've completely missed the experience and the essence.
Oh, so Louisville's neat, and it's funny because if somebody internationally asks me where I'm from, I say Louisville, Kentucky, because it's where you got the Louisville Slugger bats.
Right.
And there's a huge bat factory. Is also right. Kentucky is home of bourbon, so the Bourbon Trail, and so that's a super fun thing that you can go to all these distilleries that have been there for 300 years and hear about kind of their history. And then you got the Kentucky Derby as well, which is kind of the once-a-year thing that locally nobody goes to, but is a big deal and kind of televised. So yeah, it's a lot more. Yeah, it's funny because I love Indiana, and West Lafayette and Indianapolis are great, but like with Indianapolis, if I talk to that, everybody knows the Pacers and probably the Colts, but outside of that, in the Indy 500, you really got to grasp at straws for non-sports things. So easier to talk to those from Louisville.
Okay, but so these are kind of what it's renowned for. So, but is there anything like that if you're a hard local in Louisville that you would recommend doing or seeing?
I don't know. Well, I mean, it's hard because I've been up here since I was 18.
Right.
So I don't know that I can really kind of profess to the local experience without ruffling feathers or something. But I mean, yeah, I would say that I don't know. I really like Louisville has this wonderful waterfront park along the Ohio River. And so it's this huge green expanse, and now have these walkable bridges across where you can go to the Indiana side. They have some really nice restaurants on both. You have a steamboat, the Belle of Louisville, along there. So I would say that's kind of the nicest if you're like passing through and want to kind of do something nice, if it's just a stopover or kind of like that. That's kind of my favorite thing.
Okay. So now we have the kind of the inside scoop on Louisville. There's also a fantastic makerspace there, actually.
Oh, really?
Like,
okay.
If you're into engineering, it's super fun to visit.
Right, and they do. And Louisville's interesting because they do also have one of the NNCI, so the National Nanotechnology Coordinated Infrastructure. One of those sites is in Louisville, and so they have a clean room there. Is kind of one of those that is, I wouldn't say open to the public, but that's kind of the purpose, is that they kind of take fab jobs nationally, and if you have like a small company or something, you can go in there.
Oh, very interesting.
It's at University of Louisville. But yeah, that's a neat. Also, in kind of the nanofab world, is a neat thing to stop by if you're ever interested.
Okay, so yeah, I guess that would be an interesting tour to do of the country. Just visit all the nanofabs.
Yes, which you could, because they're all in cities, right? So you could definitely kind of go city hopping and try to see all the fabs. It's tough because some are, you can just kind of see them like Birck. Some of them are kind of nestled away, and you'd have to get special access. But right, yeah, no, that's a neat idea.
That would be very interesting, actually, to do. So you're growing up in Louisville, and like, I guess when did you first become aware that you wanted to do something related to engineering? Right? Was there a moment, like a class or a teacher or something, that really motivated you to go into engineering as compared to painting?
Yes, I do want to say, so I grew up in Georgetown, Indiana, so it's across this Louisville metro. Nobody knows where Georgetown is, but I can't claim myself to have grown up in the city, right? But
that's fair.
I would say, I think for me, I always really liked, I would say, some of the more intuitive sciences, so kind of like the chemistry, physics. I always found those very interesting, and just kind of, I think kind of the intuitive analytical part of that.
Okay.
That was always, I think, much more interesting. Kind of mathematics have always been fine at, but it's not. I tend to skip steps, so that's always like it's like I can do triple integrals and things, but it's painful. Like I don't want to do that. I always miss the negative sign.
Right.
So yeah, but I would definitely say that it's more of I think just those kinds of subjects were kind of, I knew that I really liked those kinds of problems, and so wanted to kind of find something that was involving those.
Oh, that's actually very interesting, because like we'll get to your career later, as to like what you did your PhD in, but that actually brings an interesting question. If you say like physics and chemistry and the intuitive sciences, but then you came here and you did electrical engineering, so how did you go from, like, because that's the thing in high school, right? Unless your school is rich, we usually don't have like dedicated like electrical programs or robotics or things. So how did you make the decision to go into electrical instead of chemistry or physics or one of the other departments?
Yeah, so that was, I think, when I got here. I mean, I knew I was kind of I was into computers, and so that was kind of a draw into EE, but I was also looking at kind of like physics, materials, those kinds of things, and so kind of did the thing my freshman year where took kind of 1 credit hour survey courses, and so kind of did some of that in materials engineering, as well as did kind of a little bit of physics, and kind of very quickly kind of realized, okay, maybe don't like these as much, kind of feel more at home in this kind of a thing.
Okay.
And so that's kind of where EE kind of felt like the best fit at that stage, and so that kind of use that to kind of feel out how to specialize.
Okay, so this leads to a sort of humorous question. So ECE clearly, or electrical, was clearly the one that won out in the end. But which department did you take a survey course and think to yourself, I absolutely never want to do anything like this ever again?
Yeah, I don't think there was anything where I was like, I couldn't do this. Like, I think that, within engineering, I think everything kind of has its more kind of typical problems and just kind of a feel. So I don't think there was anything where I was just like, this is disgusting and I can't put up with this or something like that. I think it was more like, this doesn't really feel like a great fit. Like I'm not not really like ABE. Like I'm not a plant guy. I don't have a lot from there. That's not my thing. So that's kind of when I was like, yeah, that's probably not where I want to end up. That's not a good.
Right.
Doesn't really resonate.
Did you take a survey course in ABE?
No, not an ABE. No, I did one in materials engineering actually. It was with Professor Carol Handwerker and Alejandro Straka. And that was incredibly interesting. I mean, that was neat because they talked about had been involved with after 9/11 with going in with NIST at the Twin Towers and kind of looking at what happened and piecing those together. So yeah, it was definitely a thing that I definitely came away with a very, I think, a healthy respect and a good perspective is kind of what that constituted. So yeah, but was more kind of I would say that kind of mechanical engineering or kind of a different kind of set from kind of the more physics EE type with kind of your Maxwell's equations and things. So that's right. Those were the kinds of things that I think was more interesting or just kind of resonated more with me.
That's what they told me whenever I was doing physics. They said, how can you decide if you should do physics? So like if you like the intro mechanics courses, then you should maybe consider like mechanical engineering. But if you like E&M, that's more physics style. So yeah, so I guess there's like a pretty strong breakdown between field equations and like diffusion equations.
There is, yes, and I mean, and also too, I mean, I didn't end up in physics. So I mean, there's a very big difference between doing kind of the really hardcore drill down in terms of the science and the math and what's going on, and just kind of staying at the higher level of these are electrons, they do things you don't really need to know, So yeah, there's definitely a difference there too.
The exact solution of.
Which, well, I mean, unless you're in, doing quantum stuff now, right? So it definitely does depend on kind of your specific area.
That's definitely, nowadays, definitely, as it gets to quantum optics and things, it's just starting to all merge because it's too, basically your like large scale equations are starting to break down and everything is, you got to do the painful version of this. You don't have the convenience of continuum equations anymore. So so you start your ECE now. Within ECE, kind of which branch did you start to gravitate to? Because you've made a decision now. You're an electrical engineer. You're starting to get into the specialization. Like which branch did you gravitate to most, and why?
So I think I did in my ECE 201 class was taught by Professor Minghao Chi, and so I had at the time had gone to office hours a couple times and kind of found out about his research and doing with silicon resonators, those kinds of things, and so I ended up getting involved in a summer surf project actually at Birck. So I've started at Birck was the summer of 2007, which is very long time ago. I mean, that's what, 13 years now.
So that's actually true. That's like early on. Because Birck opened in 2005, right? So that's within 2 years. Yeah, and
I don't know that it was really operational till maybe like 2006. So it was still kind of very much in the kind of the formative stages and.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I guess you actually overlapped with one of our previous speakers, right?
Oh, maybe, yeah. No, and it is interesting because I mean, it's as far as Birck as a community is kind of tricky because if you just kind of come and hole up in the clean room is different from using the general labs, from kind of just being maybe just kind of doing computer sim, which you maybe do in your office, maybe just do at home.
Right.
So, but yeah, no, I think I would have overlapped there at some point with me kind of as this baby sophomore undergraduate versus the researchers. But yeah, no, that's a good point.
That's yes, it is interesting how, because Birck is relatively young as a research institution. So yeah, that's true. There are only a handful of generations of students that have gone through here, and I guess you've seen the inaugural class come through and leave. So I guess this is an interesting kind of historical question. How would you say the culture of Birck has changed from 2007 to today? Like, just do you see a difference in people's attitudes toward research or towards working in Birck? Do you see a change in that?
I mean, I think there's this natural thing when you have something new, right? Like if you buy a new car, your first inclination is that, well, nobody can eat or drink in it, right? Like I got to make sure that this doesn't. And so, I mean, definitely when the facility opened, there was a lot of concern about, I mean, it was much more harping and training on just kind of how to use tools, lab protocols, safety rules, those sort of things.
Yeah.
And definitely, it never felt in kind of a punitive way, but was much more of a, we need to kind of teach you how to exist in this shared space.
Mm-hmm.
And that's, I think the whole concept of kind of the shared use facility is tough because you have kind of these parallel knowledge tracks of, one is kind of within the group and then the other is with the facility as a whole.
Right.
And so it is a thing that as I think the facility kind of continued to kind of grow and evolve, that I think like most facilities, I think that's kind of changed a little bit, and it's not. I think now is kind of more up to. I think in a way is kind of more up to the groups to kind of do some of that mentoring, but it's hard because with I think a lot of the research models now,
mm-hmm.
And just kind of the way the DARPA model works, that you have to get results much quicker than you did.
Even in 2007. Oh, interesting. So
yeah, because in terms of when you have to do check-ins with how's the project going, and so there's kind of now there's much more of a drive that we need results every 3 months, whereas before it was much more maybe like an annual or semi-annual or something like that.
Oh, interesting.
So it's kind of hard because in a lot of groups, you have these very experienced users, but they may not really have the time to kind of do the mentoring of their younger students. And that's also something that was also very different for me, is because when it started, it was kind of like, like how the Sith, there's always like the master and the apprentice, but like Fab was you always had like the guy who knew what they were doing and then someone who was kind of there learning. But it was always in pairs. Like it was never more, like never less. It was always like, okay, there's this one from this group. They have these two Fab people, and then they might be kind of the same level of experience.
Yeah.
That's just how it was always done. And now I see a lot more of instead of being where you have a group where you have, okay, these are the simulation folks, these are the Fab folks, these are the measurement folks.
Yeah.
It's much more that you have kind of everybody in the group trying to do some Fab and some measurement and those kinds of things. And as someone who that's kind of how I did my PhD and why it took so long, if you kind of notice on my CV, is that it takes very long to learn all three of those areas. So it's good because it's a much more complete overview of what you're doing, and I think really builds your understanding. But man, is it painful. So.
Okay, so yeah, it sounds like we're gonna have a lot of fun because painful experiences are the ones that yield all of the interesting learning.
Yes, growth. Yes.
Yeah, that's so. Okay, so you go through and basically you gravitated toward optics, which it sounds like because you were going into materials. I'm guessing it's somewhat this mix between this, because optics, maybe more than a lot of other fields, is so dependent on materials. Because literally, if I will be a little bit like oversimplifying, but if you're making circuits, right, you're not thinking about like what the interconnect lines are going to be, on your PCB. Correct. Right? It's more systems level, whereas in optics, it's like you have to do this material or it will not work. So would you say that you gravitated toward it because of your kind of interest in this more electromagnetic physics sort of thing and materials interest?
Yeah, I think it's, I think especially with, nanophotonics is kind of this interesting mix of, kind of the Maxwell's equation side of kind of physics and electrical engineering, of the, like you said, the materials side, because what you can do is completely dependent on the material properties, and especially at the nanoscale, right? That is, refractive index breaks down, right? You got to worry about heat transfer and all these kind of weird things. But then also just kind of the, just kind of the nanoscale integration of, then you have to worry about surface roughness, right? What does silicon look like when you try to get it down to 2 nanometers? Is that a good thing to do? We have this other interesting glass, but maybe it's terrible on the edges, so we shouldn't use that. So yeah, I would definitely think that's part of why it seems so interesting.
Yeah, we definitely see that a lot in Professor Shalayev's group, is that you have to start from in order to be really decent in optics, you have to really have a good understanding from fab end first. Because it is so tied to the actual materials and the fabrication. So you do this research with Professor Minghao Chi. How did that go?
It was fine. It was it's funny looking back, because essentially what the project, so what I was doing was trying to get the interference lithography set up in the clean room working. Okay. And so, you try to, I think with undergrad research, right, you come in kind of bright-eyed and bushy-tailed and think you're going to get this, first author Nature paper. But really what it was is that we have this thing and it doesn't work, and none of the graduate students have the time to figure it out. So let's let Justin tinker around with it for a couple months. So that's, so basically what the what the work was basically just doing kind of this optical alignment of this UV laser, these mirrors, and we ended up needing to kind of come up with an enclosure in the clean room, because it's funny because the laser and the performance of it are actually somewhat compromised in the clean room because of the laminar airflow is enough to kind of cause these mechanical vibrations. Oh, and so needed to kind of build a very rudimentary, in the form of PVC pipe and kind of thick black plastic, way to kind of shield the airflow so that it didn't do that, and you kind of got good results. So that's what that ended up being. And I'm sure it's funny looking back on it, because I'm sure some staff member found that and had to pull it out of the clean room 5 years after the project and was like, what on earth were they doing, kind of a thing.
What I really want to see is you at Home Depot buying PVC pipe and tarp, being like, this is for my nanofabrication project. Yes,
correct. And sitting at home on the couch and being like, I don't know, do I want this one? Is the 8 mil better than the 15 mil? I don't know which of these. Yeah. Right. Yeah. So, but it's sometimes, I think sometimes expensive, solutions need to be very specific and expensive, and sometimes they don't.
Sometimes it's that you find the answer at Home Depot.
Yes, exactly.
I'm always more impressed, actually, by people who find specific solutions out of things that were not meant to do that. Actually, I think that's the mark of true engineering creativity, because it's if you throw $1 million at any problem, right, and have a custom machine solution, you could get high performance. But doing it with random parts, that's much harder. But
yes, no, it's always interesting to me to talk to people who have been very experienced in the lab and in fab and those kinds of things, because you do run into those kinds of problems. And like you said, they're very expensive solutions, and sometimes they're very cheap, easy solutions that you don't know about unless you've been doing it for 10 years or a decade, or one of those people has told you about it.
Right.
And that's if you're just starting and you don't have that kind of group knowledge, you don't know, right? You may spend months trying to find this solution, and it may be just real easy. Well, those are very specific also. So
those are the most those are the kinds of engineering projects that are very interesting. It's whenever you see a solution, and it looks like a plastic tarp and some plastic, but in reality, it's actually really, really thought out. And there's a huge amount of effort in some cases that goes into these very simple looking things.
Yes.
Which, you look at it and you're like, oh, that's obvious. But coming up with that is not. So
right. No, and I think it's kind of I think it's Mark Twain's quote that I'm sorry I didn't write you a short letter. I didn't have the time. That it takes less time to do this kind of overcomplicated thing, where a lot of the time goes is in figuring out where you can simplify and what you can cut.
Right.
And so it's definitely something that, I do think that is those solutions come out of experience and time invested.
Right, and just a lot of painful
yes
experience. The worst papers, right, are the ones where you see some step and you're like, why does this involve flipping this thing over at this in this weird way? And that's months of somebody just like throwing something in weird ways to try to get it to do something, and it's just
well, and that's the thing with papers too, is that if they put it in there, you're lucky, right? They maybe omit that step, and so you can't, it's not reproducible because you didn't know you had to hold it at a 45-degree angle for 30 seconds
blowing on it. And
that's, I mean, the one of my, it wasn't the focus of my PhD thesis, but one of the kind of projects I did, having learned all this stuff at the end, that got into, I think it was Nature Communications, but ended up being the fourth author on that just because of the fab. But I mean, what ended up making it was basically that this other group was trying to do a very similar thing. They couldn't get it to work. And we did, only because you have to worry about stiction. And basically is that as water evaporates, right, it creates this force. And so the only thing that I did different was that when I took it out of, after the final rinse, instead of going right to drying it, I just put it into IPA and then dried it after that. And that's, I mean, that's a super simple step, but that was really the crux of why it was hard to do at that scale. So sometimes it is the simple things that take a long time to figure out, and those experiences are really what give you the really interesting results.
Yeah, I remember I was trying to clean pieces. I spent a month cleaning silicon pieces, and I thought I was losing my mind because I would clean them in every imaginable way, right? Holding the pieces, drying them at angles, like air drying them, water drying them, every combination. And every time I'd put it in dark field, it's just like the starry sky. And it turns out that metal tweezers will always put particulates on your silicon pieces as you move them from beaker to beaker. And it's just, a month of just hours.
Yes.
Wasted pieces. It's something so simple, but that's how it goes. So you do your undergrad research, and then I see that you got this Andrew Graduate Fellowship, which for people outside of Purdue, that is like the top fellowship you can get, if I'm not mistaken, coming to Purdue.
From the university,
Right, I think so that's quite impressive. So how did you choose Purdue, right? Because if you get a fellowship like this from Purdue, I'm sure you had other universities that were interested, but you clearly chose to come here. Was there a particular reason, or?
Yeah, I mean, I think for me the things were, I mean, one is, I mean, it's close to family, and so that being within the state of Indiana and trying to look at nanofab, there's not a lot of places around, and so that was one. But I mean, I think also, I mean, was the fact that I was very lucky to get. I mean, so for my undergraduate, I mean, got my tuition covered, because at the time, if you're a National Merit Scholar, they covered that.
Oh, wow.
And then got the Andrews Fellowship for my master's work. And so, I mean, it essentially got all of my grad work and then kind of went into an RA-ship. So I got all of my schooling paid for that way through Purdue. And so I do feel very lucky, and feel like the state of Indiana has invested in me. And so I think that's part of, for me, is that I, in working at Birck and trying to kind of help with the user base, kind of feel like it's kind of giving back and hopefully paying on that investment to some degree.
Right.
That was part of it. But then it's also, and two was, I think, had at the time was working with both Professor Chi, but then also Professor Andy Weiner, who I'd taken his optics class with, and was kind of very interested there. So kind of had been offered that fellowship, and then also some very kind of interesting things on the research side to look at both kind of the optics side and then also kind of the nanofab side.
Okay, so it was a very nice combination of financial opportunity, family, quality of education, and also that you already had a very nice group of people to work with at Purdue. So everything came together. That's really actually very nice, because you have that big advantage of having already kind of the understanding of how everything works. because that sometimes that takes time to, like, for example, at Birck, right, getting to know the staff, knowing who to ask, so you were able to slipstream much faster. So we get to your PhD. So what was like the research project that went the most horribly? that you're like, oh my goodness, never again.
I don't. Let me think. I mean, I don't think I ever had. I don't think I had any kind of specific dead ends like that. So we did have what I was started with my PhD work with. I think this kind of comes back to material properties and things, but that was kind of trying to do on-chip polarization rotation with silicon waveguides.
Mm-hmm.
And so, I mean, spent a very long time doing that and a lot of kind of optical setup and those kinds of things. But I mean, what we kind of found out once we got down to it was that it came down to the surface roughness. That there was this kind of intrinsic, you get this intrinsic scattering between modes in the waveguide because of your silicon. And so we were trying to going from silicon nitride, which is much bigger, smoother edges, working at different wavelengths, down to silicon. And so kind of saw after we kind of got to that point that like, oh, okay, this isn't really gonna, this kind of 4-year project is not gonna pan out that way because of this. And that's kind of one of those things that, it's research, right? You never know if it's gonna work or not.
Of course, yeah.
But I mean, I think that at least for me, I mean, my project-wise, I kind of started out doing in silicon doing grading couplers, so kind of doing the characterization, and then into the rotators, and then did into my PhD work, which is using rings to detect bacteria.
That was with the AFRL at
Andrews Air Force Research Lab in Dayton. Yeah.
Did you actually go there to do the work?
I did, yeah. Which was crazy because it was kind of this. I mean, it was basically the setup was spent about a year to two, maybe about a year doing the simulation work at AFRL because it's working in the government labs. They're very specific about kind of internet access and those kinds of things. So you can't just like remote in. So I was on site doing that and then came back here to do the fabrication and then back to AFRL in Dayton for the measurement. And so it was a lot of driving from, from Birck over to Dayton, Ohio, which is about a 3-hour trip.
Okay.
So I had a lot of books on tape and just kind of, going back and forth. But it was very much you had to kind of get stuff and get there and kind of try to plan life around that. So that was
it's interesting. When I started, I had to do depositions at Notre Dame, and it's exactly the same thing. That's when I got an Audible account. And
yes,
so I've listened to so many books,
which is wonderful, right? I mean, it's a huge chunk of time, but look how well read you are now. So.
Exactly, yeah. Now I've read way more than I would have. So you're going through this and surface roughness. Like there's things in the fab that go from quite nice, but the more intolerant the process to something like surface roughness, the more horrible the processing project. So so how did you, like, while you're doing your PhD, right? I'm sure that particularly with the process development problems like this, like how do you stay motivated, like on a day-to-day level, right? To keep, because it is tough, right? You make it, and the worst is whenever it's almost right. But it never is right, like how do you stay, from just getting kind of, I wouldn't say failure, but after kind of not the thing you want? Because
maybe missteps is the best word for that, or a mishap, right? Because it's not, I mean, I think in fab, every time it doesn't work is a learning experience.
Right. So well, you have to have this attitude, otherwise you will lose your mind.
You do, yeah, no, you do, yeah. And it's, I think that it is, I think what it taught me was just the importance of, I think both kind of within methodology of being intentional about procedure and then also being intentional about recording that procedure. Because we had, I mean, especially early on, had experiences with stuff that worked really well, but not knowing why, right? Because the next time it doesn't. And so I think kind of learn to get in the habit of every time doing anything, right, you have to have your recipe, and that has to be specific. But then also need to, I think, keep in mind with that not all of those variables matter. And so to kind of be mindful of what you need to be sure is kept the same, and to also kind of do your research about what can change and it's not a big deal, right? Like if it's kind of like with photoresist, right? If you leave AZ1518 on a hot plate for 10 minutes instead of 2 minutes, you've got a very different thing. If you do that with PMMA, it doesn't do anything different. And so you really do have to, I think it saves time to look into, okay, what is this doing on a physical level? Why do I need to worry about this? Do I need to worry about this? Does it matter? Maybe it doesn't. So
because I found, well, personally, and I'm curious how you deal with this issue, but I found that there's actually a danger to being over careful with your recipes initially. Because the problem is that if you, let's say you're like, I want to be conservative and bake this overnight, or not bake it, but dehydrate it or whatever overnight, just to be sure. The problem is if it works, then you don't want to experiment, and then you end up, cumulatively wasting tons of time. So what I try to do is to do the minimum, like most sloppy method, and then see if that works, and then if it's not working, then modify it out. But I'm just curious how you deal with this sort of over care initially, or do you start with the most rigid procedure and then lax it out, or?
Yeah, I think you have, at least in my mind, I mean, the way to start is always with kind of erring on the side of caution and inspecting it at every single step, because you can't, I mean, like you said with your tweezers, right? Unless you look to see, is my wafer actually clean, you can't know. But for me, at least, it was kind of a thing where I will start with kind of, this is, the standard clean, right? Sonication for 5 minutes at each and go through. But then when I drop something in the spinner and then I need to clean it, that's when I'll just say, well, let me just squirt it with acetone and dry it, and let's see what happens. So it's kind of trying to, then you have kind of your samples that these are good, and then you've got the ones that might have been screw ups. Let's see how we can cut corners and see what we can salvage, because it's not worth it to go back at that point. But, so that's kind of how I do it, is kind of doing in these two bins and kind of learning on the fly with, well, what happens if we do this? Okay. Sometimes you only know if you've tried it, and there's no way to know. So. Right.
Yeah. So that's actually critical too. I think that's a really good advice, is always inspect everything, because that's the thing I learned. It's like you think you know how to tie your shoes, but until you look down and make sure they're tied, they're not tied.
Right. Well, and that too, I think is something that I mean, my big thing I think with fab is that I absolutely hate having to redo stuff. And that's, I mean, fab is not forgiving for that. So it's kind of one of those things that it will make your life easier if you are careful, because you will catch mistakes instead of waiting 2 months and getting to the end of this device and being like, oh crap, it doesn't work. So it's, I would say that being methodical and doing that inspection is the lazy thing to do, because then you don't have to redo stuff. Then you can kind of catch it when it happens and can adjust on the fly.
Exactly. Because the reason I was cleaning pieces was because I was about to do material growths, and I don't want to like have weird features and then not know if it's because my film isn't clean. But to put it in perspective with the inspection, so I go to my group mate and I say, I cannot clean pieces. And he's like, let me show you what a clean piece is. We put his piece under the microscope. It's horrific.
Yes.
And he's like, what? Because nobody...
You can get a PhD and still not know how to clean pieces. Yes, because it doesn't matter for some projects.
It doesn't cross your mind that it can be dirty. It looks clean. You look at it, it's spotless, but you put it under the microscope, it's a disaster.
Right. I mean, it is, right. It's relative, right? So, I mean, there are definitely projects where that's fine, right? And it would be a waste of time to worry about it. But if you're doing something like, I'm trying to get this really continuous film without pinholes, you absolutely have to worry about that. So I think that's where I think being intentional about kind of doing some of the background research to say, okay, well, what's really going on? What do I care about? What happens at that level really pays off, because you get to know, maybe I don't care about the cleanliness. Maybe I just squirt it off with IPA and it's fine. Or maybe I need to do this much more advanced kind of, specific clean that is going to be required.
Right, right. So because we're unfortunately getting closer to the end. So I do want to ask you this. So in about 2016, you're still doing your PhD and you become an optoelectronics research engineer. What prompted this? And what's going on? Like, that's unusual for a PhD student to become employed right at their institution, right in the middle of their PhD.
Yeah. So I mean, for me, I knew at least in the kind of the near long term that needed to be in Indiana. Because my wife is actually in kind of a similar position. So she's a physician over at IURNet, but got her med school paid for by the state. But as a result of that, had to practice for 4 years within the state of Indiana.
Okay.
So I'm basically nearing the end of my program and knowing that I need to do something within the state, and know at this point that I'm not interested in the faculty track. That my least favorite part is the writing portion, and writing grants all day, every day does not seem like a fun way to kind of spend my time. And so, so the research engineer position opened up and was kind of at a point that I somewhat foolishly thought that, I'll be done with my PhD by then. This was maybe February.
Okay.
Like, yeah, I'm so close. We'll be done by then.
I can say, from knowing other people trying to get their PhDs, it's not over until it's deposited, the committee says everything's good, and Purdue's admin gets it done.
Yes. So that it was a good fit for me, family-wise. It was also, I think, got to stay kind of on more in kind of the processing problem kind of being. That's I say what I really like about my position is kind of get to be kind of a freelance process consultant just to kind of the users. And so I really like, that's what kind of drew me to it, is being able to kind of look at new problems and try to kind of figure out, well, what's the issue here? What can you do to fix it? That kind of thing.
Right.
It's always been very interesting. And so the ability to do that was a big plus for me. But yeah,
that actually brings us to a question from the audience. They say, what's the best way to reach out to staff for guidance when we get stuck with problems in fab? So
yeah, and it's kind of one of those things, because it depends, I think, on the level of the issue. If it's a simple question like spin speed or something, email's the best way if you know who to ask, but email's very siloed. And so pre-COVID, that's when we were doing, I would say, the in-person fab forums. And so the idea there was to kind of do a way to do discussion, basically to get snacks for one, right? But then to also kind of do a discussion with the staff on your issues and hear what other students are asking about.
Right.
So you can kind of ask your question, but then can also learn from what other people are struggling with, maybe talk to them about what they're doing. So a year ago, I would have said that. Right now, we're kind of struggling on that because email's fine, but it's very siloed, right? So we're trying to use the NSAC help channel on Teams.
Right.
To kind of do that, because what that allows us to do is that it can be something that's either going to be answered by a specific staff member or by many staff members or by other users who might see that. So we're trying, that's one avenue. You can also, we have kind of a comments page on the wiki, but hasn't taken off as much. So I would say right now, email is good, but we're trying to push towards the help channel on Teams for NSAC. And we'll also be, we'll say, Sam, I don't know if I'd mentioned this to you, but we're going to be in the new BNC 151, are going to have everybody join the Teams channel, join the NSAC Teams team, so that everybody can kind of be on board and use that. I think
that would be great, because it's tough to get everyone like moving in the same.
Yes, because you can't. Right, and that's the thing with right now is you can't just kind of come and visit us in the office.
Right.
And I can't have a 30-minute conversation over email. That's just not. It's not doable. But it's sometimes you can do a quick Teams chat for 5 minutes, cover it, or maybe we do it instant messenger. We don't even have to see each other. So those are kind of the best ways right now.
Okay, but when Birck is open, you highly recommend people just come over to the office.
After everybody's vaccinated, yes.
Yeah, well, I mean, assuming that COVID is
long
gone.
term.
Yeah, long term, that would be
Yeah,
the way
long term, I would say the best thing to do is hopefully we get these in-person fab forums back going.
Okay.
But in the meantime, definitely leverage Teams and email if you have to.
Okay.
So that's what I would say there.
So just to kind of wrap up on your story, what I'm curious about is, so basically what I'm understanding is for your PhD, you sort of basically finished your PhD and you were kind of in the last stages of, I'm assuming, writing a couple last papers and maybe doing a few last experiments. And then you became a research engineer, and then I'm assuming it's just sort of like chipping away at the wall slowly. Like, how did you manage being a research engineer and a PhD student at the same time?
Poorly. I don't recommend it. It's so I mean, basically what happened is I finished my experimental portion a week before I started full time. And so I had in my mind that, okay, well, I just need to, do some data processing, figure this stuff out, and then just write my thesis. No big deal.
Right.
And that, if I had not been working, probably would have taken about 6 months, which I didn't realize at the time. But yeah, so instead that got drug out over about 3 years. So basically what happened is that it's, with a lot of research, you really have to, once the ball's moving, you have this kind of momentum on a project of knowing where you're at and keeping that going.
Yeah.
And so that's kind of why it took so long on that end, is because in trying to do, specific MATLAB code to kind of data mine for what I was looking for, it takes ages. And so in my head, I was like, okay, well, I'll just do that for an hour or two in the evenings, and that didn't really work that well. So yeah, so instead kind of had to look at kind of taking some specific breaks, get this chunk done, and then do the writing.
Okay.
So I definitely don't recommend doing that, but it was at a point for me where, it was at the end of my program, and so I wanted to capitalize on the opportunity.
Right.
And this was also, when my son was close to being born, and so didn't want to have to kind of raise a child on a grad salary. Not ideal. So yeah, so it was yes. So yeah, I don't recommend that. But yeah, my recommendation would be get finished at least to the point to where you're going to deposit, and then look for a job. But it's not always, things don't always work that way. So
right. It seems like actually you've beaten the odds, because I know a lot of people that kind of are kind of ABD. It's very hard actually it's tough, right? Because like family starts to become a much more time dominant. It's not just time, but mentally dominating kind of thing. Where 2 hours in the evening, mentally, good luck.
Correct.
What's just more kind of specific, is there any strategy you found that actually worked? Because you said you did it in chunks. How did you carve out the time? How did you get kind of the mental space to do it? Was there any tactic you used? I know some people might wake up like at 5 a.m. before everyone else just to get in like an hour of calm thinking. But was there anything that you found was effective?
Nothing that I would say. I mean, for me, to kind of get into that kind of writing space and do that, I kind of needed extended, I would say, focus. And so, yeah, ended up kind of just holding myself up for the weekend.
Okay.
Yeah, I got to the point where I realized I just can't do
an hour,
any work stuff or family stuff. Yeah, it's just I just have to be here for 2 days, and it's going to take some time to get into a productive space, but then to kind of maximize the amount of time once I'm in there.
I see.
So
it's sort of like you negotiate. I'm assuming what happened basically is that your son got to a certain age where he can be supervised. And I'm assuming you negotiated with your wife to be like, I need 2 solid days to just work on this.
Yeah, my wife and family are very supportive and patient, and I love them for it, especially my wife. Yes, but that's kind of what it came down to, is I can't be here this weekend. I have to do this.
Okay.
And a lot more of those weekends than I originally anticipated, because I mean, that's the thing with research, is you don't know how long it's going to take, right? It's task based. It's not like it's just, oh, I'll just work an 8-hour thing and that'll be it. It's it takes as long as it takes.
I think that's the thing about research that's very, very tricky, is that people want results with a time frame, but it's like, if it's really research,
right?
You know, that thing that you thought would take 2 months, it's actually a 6-year project.
Yes, turns out
involves the bloodshed of a couple of grad students.
Correct.
So,
no, there really is no way. You know, you can really, I think, with deadlines, right? You can say, okay, here's our deadline. We're going to give what we've got, and then you can say, okay, we need to get this working, but you can't do both. Yeah. And so it's really a question of how much is enough. How, you know, when do you draw the line? Those kinds of things.
Okay.
But yeah, it's very true.
So, and then I guess to kind of wrap up, because we're actually over time a bit, what do you see as the big challenges for Birck kind of in the next 3 to 5 years as an organization?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it will be, it's still, I think there's a lot of uncertainty with COVID, especially because, I mean, with the, you know, the shared use lab model really requires people. Right. And so it's tricky because, you know, especially this year, our usage is way down necessarily, right? Because we're dedensified. Everybody has to be, you know, as much as possible working from home. So I think one of the big challenges over the very near term is seeing, you know, I mean, at least how it looks now, right? Hopefully there's going to be this wonderful vaccine that comes out and everybody can get in the next 6 months, and that everything goes back to normal. Right. But there's a good amount of uncertainty there. I think beyond that, it's kind of a question of bigger picture. I think with research in kind of the U.S. And in universities, just because it's something that we have. You know, I think there's a lot of political will towards kind of lowering taxes, which means spending less money on things. And this, so I think in large part, what that means is that a lot of what used to be government funded, I think, will become increasingly private funded. And we kind of already see this with a lot of like the Microsoft QStation project back decades ago would have either been in kind of a Bell Lab style thing where they're doing this in-house, or it would, you know, something in the company. And so what we're going to see, I think, is more interest from both companies, both big and small, in kind of leveraging the university infrastructure, which is a very good thing. But it is definitely a change from most of that money coming maybe from the NSF. Okay. So I think that's kind of a difference, and kind of a question of, can we, you know, right now I think Birck is very focused on our internal users, but I think there's a question of, is there a way that we can make ourselves, knowing that we're in the middle of a cornfield and in the middle of Indiana, more attractive to either a big company or a small company to come and leverage our tool set. Okay. So I think both of those, right, as well as hopefully not, you know, I think bigger picture politically, I think that I think there's a real uncertainty about what the grad student population is going to look like. I mean, we've kind of had all of this wonderful talent come in internationally to the U.S. for decades, and does that still stay, you know, 2020 and beyond? Right. So, or how does that work? So I think those are kind of both the bigger things, and then more specific Birck-wise is kind of how do we adapt to those? Right. Okay. Yeah, it's a lot to worry about. It is, and it's one of those that, you know, you can, if you, it's good to plan for the future, but in nobody could have planned in 2019. Yeah. Nobody would have thought this year would have been this, and so you can only, you know, I mean, the best laid plans of mice and men, right? So it's kind of looking at what the future looks like from here, but you have to course correct as it goes. So. I do look forward to being like, so your PhD, why did it take longer? Well, you know, there was a global pandemic that I totally planned for. Exactly. No, yeah, don't. I don't think you can underplay that card in 5 or 10 years, especially to your children or something like that. Yeah. Oh, yeah. No, definitely. They're going to suffer from hearing about. I'm like, yeah, we had to sit inside all day, every day.
But so any kind of final advice that you'd have for Birck researchers, kind of just general, anything you would like, I guess there's a nice question that says, if you had a billboard to give some life advice to everyone, kind of what would you suggest?
I think the biggest thing is, and again, this is hard with COVID, right? But is just talk to people. Is that we have this incredibly talented, experienced, diverse group of researchers here, and everybody is working on their own problem, but there's a lot of overlap between those.
Right.
And it's especially if you're working on something as a new student, there may be a lot of experience in your group, but your older students don't know everything. They only know the things that they've done.
Right.
And so most of understanding, whether it's in fab or simulation, or those things come from having done things. And so the biggest shortcut you can do is to kind of, I think, casually talk to people and, ask like, well, what are you working on right now? Or what are you stuck on, right? What sort of things are you dealing with? Because then, people are usually very happy to vent about whatever, this thing in the fab, right? You're like talking about your metal tweezers, right? That's the kind of thing that no one knows to ask that, but that if you're in that moment struggling with it, people are very happy to talk about it. And so I think that's where you can really get a leg up in your research, is by noticing people who are doing similar things, not necessarily exactly the same, and figuring out what problems they see. Because those are probably problems that either you are seeing or that you should be worried about or that you may see later on. So that would be the big one, I think, is just talk to people. Okay,
that is fantastic advice, and I think we have to wrap it up now. But Justin, thank you so much for kind of giving all this wisdom that you've collected over the years to everyone. It's been a wonderful time talking to you, and I thank you again, not just for this interview, but for everything that you've done at Birck. I think there's been a quantum leap in the sort of social fabric of Birck, actually, since you've started to work at Birck. And I want to thank you on Birck community part, and also for NSAC and for myself, actually, because you've helped me so much over the years with so many things.
Oh, good. No, that means a lot to me to hear that. I mean, I think it's very, it's very good, I think, to hear where what things make a difference and where that makes a difference. So thank you for saying that, and thank you very much for having me here. I was very, very happy to talk to you.